asked me once, if I could go back in time, where would I go? And I said, the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era, without hesitation. And whoever asked me looked at me like I just said, I enjoy a good weekend reading the terms and conditions. Which, okay, I get what they're coming from. It is weird. But here's the thing they don't get. And the thing I think most people don't get when they look at those particular periods of history. They only look at half of it. The aesthetically pleasing parts. They see the fog, the Gothic architecture, the gas lamps, the velvet curtains, and go, oh, that's gorgeous, dark and gloomy, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's dark and horrible at the same time, so hard pass on that part. And they go back to romanticizing it like nobody's business. Because that's the wild thing. People absolutely romanticize those eras. And not only that, but I'm not talking about those eras. I'm talking about these two in particular that people love to romanticize. Why? I don't know. Like, for me, when I said it, it wasn't to romanticize them. It was because I think, well, I think honestly, like the whole bubbling of the era of just like the inventions that were coming out, the inspiration that it gives is just, it's amazing. Anyway, so the wild thing is people absolutely romanticize it. Dark academia, Victorian aesthetics, gothic fiction, of course, steampunk, anybody? All of that is a direct inheritance of this era. The clothes, the architecture, the whole mysterious stranger in a fogged city kind of vibe. People are obsessed with this. And the same people And then the same people who have a Victorian inspired mood board on their phone would absolutely not survive a single hour in 1855 London. I'm sorry, you wouldn't. And I don't mean that as shade. Absolutely not. But I mean that the gap between what the era looks like in retrospect and what it actually was in practice is wildly different. And it's one of the most interesting things I've come across as a creator and someone who thinks a lot about where creative moods come from. Because the aesthetic didn't fall from the sky. That specific feeling, the melancholy, the dread, the preoccupation with transformation and hidden identities and things lurking beneath the surface. Well, that had to come from somewhere real, right? That came from a society that was in the middle of a full psychological, breakdown, trying to process changes it didn't have language for yet. And the reason I say those two eras, it's not because I want to live there. No, I'm good. I'm one of the ones who would not survive. I may survive a day, but not long term. Anyway, but because there's always a point in a creative journey in any kind of life actually, where you're going to have to either adjust or disappear. Where the world around you is moving faster than you feel that you can keep up with. And you have to figure out who you are inside of that. The Victorians didn't have a choice. The Indian Industrial Revolution happened to them. And what came out of that, the art, the fiction, the aesthetic, everything, is what happens when a culture is forced to transform, whether it's ready or not. That's what I keep coming back to. That's why it keeps showing us stories I think about and things I want to write. Because it is under all of the fog, the Gothic cathedrals, and the impractical corsets. It's a story about transformation and the art that survived from it. The stuff we're still reading and adapting and romanticizing 150 plus years later is what people made when transformation felt like it could actually kill them. Dark, I know. And people talk, nobody actually, sorry, nobody talks about this honestly. People talk about Victorian literature as if it's just aesthetic choice. Like, ooh, Dickens was dark because he had a dark sense of humor. Like, Bram Stoker wrote a vampire story because he thought vampires were spooky. Like, the Gothic fog and gaslight glow is just a stylistic preference. And no, I'm sorry, but no. It's a deeply shallow reading of what was actually happening at that time. So, Charles Dickens, let's start there. Because Dickens is probably the writer most people have at least a surface familiarity with, and is one of the most consistently misread. Everybody knows Oliver Twist, or at least most people do. And they know, please sir, I want some more. They know about that little orphan boy and the Victorian orphanage and the general Dickensonian vibe of cold cruelty and moral poverty. But here's the thing. Dickens wasn't writing fiction. Not really. He was just reporting on what was happening in the world around him in his writings. In novel form. And London during the Industrial Revolution was not a charming place to live in. It was growing at a pace nobody designed for or had the audacity to accept most of the time. Which is actually a fascinating structural problem when you think about it, because most cities grow slow, very slow. Slow enough that infrastructure can more or less keep up. The Industrial Revolution didn't give London that courtesy, unfortunately. People poured into the city from rural areas because factories needed labor. And because enclosure acts had essentially taken away the land a lot of rural families depended on for generations. So you have this massive influx of people with nowhere to go. And the city is just absorbing them into the factories, into the neighborhoods that were not equipped for the density of people inflowing into the city. Oh, that didn't make sense. Sorry. So what ends up happening is the physical, it's genuinely horrific. We'll put it that lightly. So the Thames, or Thames, I could be saying that wrong. Anyway, was functionally an open sewer. It's gross. Like, there was a period in the 1850s called the Great Stink. For good reason. Because the smell coming off the river was so catastrophic that Parliament had to suspend its sessions just because people couldn't breathe inside the building. The water supply and sewage systems were using the same source. Child labor was a norm. Working 18 hours in a factory for wages that barely covered rent, sound familiar? Was norm. And then he went home to an overcrowded apartment and did it the next day and the next day. And see, that's what Dickens was writing inside of. That's Bleak House, which, by the way, you do need to read it. It's a really good read. It's one of the most structurally sophisticated novels of the 19th century, and also one of the most furious books I've ever read. Like, the whole thing is about the English legal system, which sounds boring, but it's about how it traps people's entire lives in a bureaucratic spiral that lasts for decades. Seriously, like, there's an inheritance case in the book that had been in the courts for so long that the people who originally filed it are dead. Think about that. Like, and the people who inherited the case inherit the waiting, and they inherit the uncertainty, and they live their whole lives adjacent to something that may resolve everything for them, but it never does. And Dickens is writing that as a direct response to real cases. Like, this wasn't invented misery. He was looking at the city, at the institutions, at what was happening to actual people instead of the industrial capitalism. And he was putting it on a page. And then you end up with Bleak House's fog. And there's a lot of fog in that book. It's practically a character itself. But the thing is it's not atmosphere for atmosphere's sake. It's a metaphor for living inside of reality. See, London was actually foggy. It was foggy because of coal. Industrial coal burning specific kinds of a thick, yellowish, sulfurous smog that Londoners called pea soupers because the visibility could drop to basically nothing. You'd be walking down a street, you'd walk 1,000 times, and all of a sudden couldn't see 2 feet in front of you. Which, let me tell you, the vibe was real. Like, the atmosphere people romanticize, the foggy streets, the dim orange light, the gothic shadows. Well, that wasn't a creative decision. That was pollution. So wonderful that we, romanticize pollution. But anyway, that was basically runoff from the industries around the town in the air. Like, Victorian London looked the way it did because it was physically poisoned by its own output. When people talk about dark academia aesthetics and that Victorian atmosphere, they're romanticizing what environmental catastrophes look like from the street level, which is crazy. And I won't let go of this. Some of the most iconic, most referenced visual aesthetics in fiction, in art, in design was coal smoke. The fog was coal. The Gothic stone darkened by decades of soot was coal smoke. I mean, think of how bad that was. Like, it was also a city that didn't have functioning sanitation, for crying out loud. Like, the beauty emerged from conditions that were literally making people sick and in some cases die. Like, the beauty about Dickens, though, is that you can feel it in his writing. Not in just the content, but in the deep heart of the stories that he wrote. There's this weight to it, this relentlessness, a sense of systems closing in on people from every direction. He wasn't just writing about poverty. He was writing about the specific texture of being a person trapped inside of progress that doesn't include you. Of watching a city get wealthier and faster and more technologically advanced than the people powering it and those people got more exhausted and more disposable. That's a very specific modern feeling, isn't it? Like, that's not just history. That's a feeling that a lot of people walking around right now relate to. And it's why Dickens still lands to this day. Not because he wrote charming orphan stories, but because he wrote what it feels like when the machine is moving and you're underneath it. And this anxiety didn't just show up as social realism. It didn't just come out as Dickens was documenting the misery. It also came out sideways. It came out as monsters. So in Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I want to talk about because this is one of the things people mess up about it. See, it is one of the most misread texts of the 19th century. And in that misreading is, well, if we're honest, it's kind of funny in a frustrating way. Because when most people think about Jekyll and Hyde, they think about it as a story about a man who makes a potion and turns evil. Well, like it's a cautionary tale about science or a split-person narrative or basically a horror story. And yeah, that's fine on the surface, but it flattens what the book is actually about. See, Victorian society was obsessed with respectability. Specifically, it was obsessed with the performance of respectability. There was a rigid social code that essentially required middle and upper class Victorians to have a certain very specific version of themselves in public. You were respectable or you were ruined. And it's not a casual standard. Your reputation was a functional asset. Your social standing determined who you could associate with, do business with, what options were available to you. And the performance was not optional. And right next to that, like literally geographically adjacent, were the poverty districts, the vice districts, the places where industrial capitalism had deposited the people it used up and discarded. The overcrowding, the addiction, the parts of the city where respectable people were not supposed to acknowledge. They were there while simultaneously relying on them to exist. See, Jekyll and Hyde made that tension flush. Jekyll isn't just a scientist who experiments on himself. He's a man who built his entire identity on the performance of respectability, who is good at that performance, who respected and has great standing, and is also carrying something inside of him that performance doesn't have room for. Something that is part of him, that exists because of the pressure of maintaining the performance, maybe. And Hyde isn't evil. Hyde is just what happens when that pressure finds a release valve. When the split becomes structural. When you divide yourself so completely between public and private that the private becomes something unrecognizable. And that's what annoys me so much, because this is not a Victorian problem. It's a humanity problem that just the Victorian society made more acceptable, I guess. Because the Industrial Revolution didn't just change economics. It changed identity. And give me a quick second, guys. Don't forget to drink water. Okay? Anyway. Alright, where were we? Let's see. Oh yes. See, the Industrial Revolution didn't just change economics. It changed it. It changed identity. Oh, It changed the relationship between who you were at work and who you were at home. And it created the concept of the professional persona in a way that hadn't existed before. It literally created the gap between public life and private life because the cities were so dense and social observation was constant and reputation was so economically loaded. And I'm going to say the obvious thing. I'm sorry, but this is exactly what social media and creator culture has done to the current generation of creative people. I said what I said. See, the algorithm-friendly persona versus the actual person underneath. See, the created public presence versus the reality of sitting at your desk all day, wondering if what you're making means anything. The performance of being a brand versus the experience of being a person. See, the split is not new. It's so old that it shows up as a monster in a Victorian novella that people are still reading and adapting. And the reason Jekyll's story ends the way it does, and if you haven't read it, I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending is not the best, we'll just say, is because Jekyll doesn't integrate his two selves. He doesn't find a way to make space for the parts that don't fit the performance. He tries to manage them. He tries to control the transformation instead of understanding it. And in that attempt, that's what destroys him. The more he tries to contain Hyde, the less control he has over when Hyde appears. So in real life, and I mean creative real life, the compartmentalization that we tend to get becomes the catastrophe. The split becomes the thing that splits you up even further. And this is the problem, because that's what happens when you try to adapt by suppressing parts of yourself instead of actually showing them off. Like, you don't manage the transformation, you just become the transformation's hostage. Jekyll is the story of someone who tried to stay the same while also changing. And the effort of holding that contradiction together was more than one person could carry. That's not dramatic. That's just what it costs when the world moves faster than you can keep up with. And about that, so I want to stay on the fear thing for a little longer, because this is the part where people skip over when they talk about Victorian Gothic fiction. And nobody talks about this. See, the monsters aren't random. None of them are. I mean, Bram Stoker published Dracula in 1897. That's the late Victorian era. Sorry. Which is also, coincidentally, or not, a period of massive anxiety about modern times. Because by 1897, Victorian England had been living inside the Industrial Revolution for long enough that the transformations had compounded. You had railways that had shrunk the entire country. Travel times that took days now took hours. You had telegraphs sending information faster than any human could physically move. You had newspapers reaching mass audiences and shaping public opinion at a scale that had never been seen before. You had science actively destabilizing religious frameworks that people had organized their entire lives around. You had women beginning to push at the rigid structures of gender and class and that Victorian respectability depended on. You had the British Empire at its peak, but it was also beginning to show the cracks, starting to accumulate the weight of what imperialism actually costs. And into all of that, Bram Stoker released a monster who was ancient, who was from somewhere else, Transylvania, which to the Victorian reader meant somewhere deeply, exotically other, who was aristocratic but decayed in a very wrong way, who moved into modern London and used the infrastructure to establish himself there, who had the capacity to transform into myths, into animals, into shadows, who could control minds, and, coincidentally, feed himself on the living to sustain himself. The fact that the heroes fight against Dracula using modern tools is not an accident either. The whole novel is structured as a document. Letters, journal entries, newspaper clippings, medical reports. It's obsessively contemporary in its form. But what it's actually about, like underneath the vampire mythology, is a collision between the old and the new. Between the ancient, the feudal, the irrational world where Dracula comes from, and the modern, industrial, technologically advanced world where the heroes live and what they're trying to defend. Because the modern world doesn't defeat Dracula through pure rationalism. It defeats him through old tools as well. Through folklore, through the crucifixes, the garlic, the wooden stakes, everything that we know. Now, and the novel ends up arguing that you need both. You need pure modernity. Anyway, I can't say that word. Pure modernism, there we go. Without any connection to the old, and then deeper frameworks as vulnerable as pure tradition without the adaptability. And that's a very specific anxiety. That's the anxiety of a culture that has moved very fast and isn't sure what it left behind in the process. And this is where it falls apart for people who try to read this stuff as just genre fiction. The transformation motif is everywhere in Victorian Gothic, for example. You got vampires, werewolves, doubles, hidden identities, scientists who become their own monsters, Dorian Gray aging in a portrait, for example, while his real body stays young. See, they're all versions of the same fear. What are we becoming? What happens when the transformation is too fast, too soon? And what happens when you can't recognize yourself in the mirror any longer? The monster is always, on some level, the thing that the transformation unleashes. The thing you're trying to leave behind that followed you into the modern world anyway. See, Dracula isn't just a vampire. He's the past that won't stay dead. He's the irrational that survives in the rational world. He's the fear that progress doesn't actually leave anything behind. That the thing humanity carries moves with it, mutates with it, and shows up in new cities wearing new faces. See, Victorian England was trying to convince itself that industrialization was a process, and progress, that the suffering it was producing was temporary. It was fun. A necessary cost on the way to something better. And this is the mistake I see when people read or write Victorian fiction. The fiction of the era is full of doubt about that story. Full of transformations gone wrong. Full of costs that the narrative wasn't accounting for. That's not a coincidence. That the culture was processing in fiction what it couldn't fully say out loud in drawing rooms and parliament. So anyway, the thing I keep turning over is what it means that we're still here, still reading this stuff, still adapting it, and still building romantic aesthetics about it. I mean, honestly, we should probably ask ourselves why. because there's something about that. But because it's not nostalgia. I mean, yeah, we claim it is. Some people do. But it's not nostalgia. Nobody wants to actually live in London in the 1880s. Trust me. Even the most committed dark academia person is not secretly hoping for cholera. It's something else. It's the feeling that those stories captured. The specific texture of anxiety about transformation, identity under pressure, being a person inside systems too large to understand or control. Resonating in a way that maps into a feeling that people are still having. The Industrial Revolution changed how people experienced time. And I may be wrong about how far back this goes, but before industrialization, time was organized around, the natural rhythms of the earth. The agricultural seasons, daylight, weather. But what Industrial Revolution did was they imposed a different relationship to time. A factory shift, the train schedule, the production quota, the wage tied to hours. People experienced a sudden introduction of industrial time that was so disorienting and dehumanizing in a way that's hard to articulate because they didn't have language for it yet. And it's like, how do you explain that? The pace of your life had been restructured from the outside. How do you name that feeling that something about modern life was too fast for the humans? Dickens named it. Stevenson named it. Stoker named it. They named it as fogs and factories and bureaucratic labyrinths and monsters. They named it transformations that couldn't be controlled and identities that cracked under pressure. And cities that were beautiful and terrible at the same time. And we're still reaching for those names because the feeling hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, it's gotten louder. The pace has gotten faster. The systems have gotten larger. The gap between the person and machine has stayed exactly as uncomfortable as it was in 1855 London. Just with different machinery and different fog. See, that's why the aesthetic survived. Not because it's pretty, although it is. That's the thing. The anxiety it was to build, to contain, is still ours to this day. The vibe only carried because the pressure that created it hasn't let up. We still split ourselves in half for audiences. We still try to remain recognizable instead of rapidly transform. We're still looking at the city we live in and feeling a specific mixture of dread and wonder that comes from being someone inside something too large and too fast to fully comprehend. And now the gaslights are gone. The coal smoke is a different kind of poison now. But if you've ever sat at your desk at midnight, wondering which version of yourself is the real one, the one that shows up online or the one that's exhausted or uncertain in a dark room, you already know what Jekyll was afraid of. You already know why Dickens was angry. You already know what Dracula was. So do with that what you will, but if things start hitting you after this, I apologize, but that's not an accident. That's just you finally paying attention. If you want more of this kind of thing, check out my link tree below. And if this actually made you think, go ahead and like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This is WriteSparky, and I will see you in the next